50 years, how time flies, right? Well, it's even more special because we have a very special guest. We have his son with us, Congressman Barry Goldwater Jr. The Goldwaters are truly a legend in Arizona. Barry's great-grandfather immigrated from Poland in 1840. His name was Mike Goldwater. He had a mercantile business, and he traveled by wagon with his merchandise, going across the Southwest, Nevada, California, through the mining camps, and he settled in 1850 in Prescott, Arizona, and opened up his first dry goods store. Was very successful, and the rest is history. I mean, we know the Goldwater brand, don't we? Absolutely. I have, and I couldn't find it. I tore my house apart today looking for my Goldwater credit card. Yes, I thought, I'm going to hold on to that, but I can't find it. But one day I'll find it. Well, it's very special. I will tell you, the first time I met Barry Goldwater Jr. was that I was chairman at the time of the Republican Gallatin County in Montana. And I thought, what better way to have a Republican roundup than to bring up Barry Goldwater Jr. So we made contact with him, and he came to Montana, and I'm telling you, we had a blast. We had a very good time. Barry Goldwater Jr., when he graduated from ASU, was the same year, same time approximately that the Goldwater store sold. So he had hoped to go into that business, but instead he ended up in California as a stockbroker, very successful, and a partner in his firm. In 1964, Barry Goldwater campaigned with his father, crisscrossed the nation. At the age of 30, Barry Goldwater Jr. ran for Congress and won. And he served in Congress from 1969 until 1984. What a wonderful thing to be in Congress and your dad to be in the Senate. Now that's a way to get the work done, isn't it? For the past 23 years, Barry has held responsible financial management positions in California, but now in the Phoenix area. He lives in Phoenix. I can tell you he's probably one of the most genuine, sincere, generous. Every time I have called and asked if he would help us with something, he has always said yes. I called him last week and asked him for a couple of other things. He said, you know, Barry, you ought to just move to Prescott. Wouldn't we love that? Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce Barry Goldwater Jr.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. Those words spoken in the acceptance of the party's nomination, my father, Barry Goldwater, launched a next generation of politics that influences today and has great impact upon the body politic and the future of our nation. I'd like to speak a little bit about my father. I try not to do it too much because I've lived in his shadow most of my life and kind of prided standing on my own 2 feet. And the other problem I have is it's so close to my heart that I sometimes have a problem not breaking down when talking about, from my heart, about my family, my mother, and my dad. I want to thank L.G. Mace for basically spearheading and fronting this meeting tonight, and this wonderful collection of memorabilia is outstanding. I don't think I've ever seen such a collection in one place at one time. And I will tell you, L.G. Mace, that when you get tired of this collection, you can donate it to the Peggy and Barry Goldwater Library, which is going to be built in Mesa on land donated by the city of Mesa. It's a $48 million project that is going to be designed to house primarily my father's papers, memorabilia, but those papers and artifacts and other writings of members of Congress and the Senate from throughout the Southwest. It will be a center for research and for other types of activities that scholars would like to pursue. And I only mention this because I was asked to give a pitch by the library. If anybody's interested, I've got some memorandums here. I think it's a great project and one that's needed to collect some of our papers from some of the great Arizona legislators, such as Mo Udall, Carl Hayden, John Rhodes, who's the congressman who was shot the borough up here? Steiger. Sam Steiger. What a great guy. I happened to serve in Congress when Sam was there. And he would always walk down with his boots and his buckle, and he'd always say something outrageous. But he was well respected. In spite of his outrageousness, he was well respected and a real spokesperson for the state of Arizona. But those kinds of heroes that we have, we've had some great legislators who've represented the small state of Arizona that have made a difference. We want to collect those papers and artifacts of these legislators and put them someplace where they are available to the public and to researchers. I also wanted to recognize Merlin Kickendall, the mayor. Good to see you, Merlin. And certainly Harvey Skoog, the mayor of the valley, the Prescott Valley. When I was growing up, there never was such a thing as the mayor of Prescott Valley. But things do change, don't they, with time? It's unfortunate that when people around us recognize what God made for us here in Prescott, they can't help but come. And, you know, that's life, that's progress, and we welcome all our friends from California.
As long as they're Republican.
I also wanted to recognize Noel Campbell, who just won election as the candidate for the state legislature. We'll be on the ballot with Karen Fan, who's representative. Now, Noel, where are you? I can't see you. Now, Noel, I don't know where to start. Noel and I were roommates in California. We were both out of college almost the same time, and we had this hot little place up in the mountains, and he was trying to become an actor and was driving taxi cabs during the night. And I was trying to be a stockbroker, but I want to tell you, Noel, we had some good times. And neither one of us wound up in jail, so that's good. I was so proud of Noel. He went on to Vietnam and flew helicopters in Vietnam, came home, flew helicopters for the border, and then more recently flying spotter airplanes for the Bor 8 bombers that are fighting our forest fires. He's an avid pilot, but he's also a great American who believes deeply in preservation of our liberties. He's a quiet kind of guy, and he's kind of casual. I didn't realize he was even running for a while until I came up here one day and he was a candidate. I saw a sign in the back of his truck. So, this is a great city with a great history, and one that my family was very much a part of. And Billy talked a little bit about it, but they came over as Jewish peddlers following the military and the miners, and established themselves here in Prescott. And of course, Morris Goldwater, one of the sons of Big Mike Goldwater, was mayor for some 20 years in the Constitutional Convention. He brought the telegraph to Arizona, started a volunteer fire brigade here, very much part of the city and its growth. It's always been home to the Goldwaters, and that's why my father has always stood on the courthouse steps to announce his candidacy for public office, and the presidency was no exception. You know, we can go back and look back, and well, before I do that, I wanted to recognize Congressman Goldwater, who's the congressman for this area. He unexpectedly got passed by the Congress to rename a post office, the Barry Goldwater Post Office, someplace here in Prescott. 442 North Valley Road. You know, that's quite an honor, and we sure appreciate the congressman for doing that. But we can go back to the early years of politics and the conservative movement, which in the 1950s began with Russell Kirk, who wrote The Conservative Mind in 1953, William Buckley in 1951, God and Man at Yale, and founding the National Review magazine. We had Milton Friedman in 1962, Frederick Hayek in 1944, in The Road to Serfdom. These are all, and then of course my father's book, The Conscience of a Conservative, were all the kind of intellectual support for the conservative movement. The 1960s were remembered as kind of a free-for-all years. We had the Beatles, 1965 Mustang car, the New World Fair. We had the Cold War and bomb shelters, if some of you remember that. We had LSD, came into being, colored TV, the Nationalist Organization for Women, and birth control pills. Now, the New York World Fair, I recall because I was in New York, and they had a machine that you put some money in a coin in a box, and you pull a lever, and out popped one of these little dolls, bubble dolls. I think they were one of the first bubble dolls. You could either have Lyndon Johnson or Barry Goldwater. And LC, you got more than your share. I also want to thank the bartender for this delicious berry ginger whiskey. But back in the 1960s, there was a movement. There was restlessness. Bill Buckley and that whole clan wanted to do something to push the conservative philosophy. And they organized. And I remember Cliff White from New York was one of the principals. They decided that Barry Goldwater would be their champion. And my father was reluctantly pushed into the forefront. Now he got there not just by happenstance. After all, he was from this little state of Arizona. And, but when he was a senator, he went around, he was chairman of the Senate campaign committee. And as a result of that, he went around the whole country talking and supporting local politics. And so when it came time to get him nominated in 1964, he had a ready army who appreciated the fact that he came into their city and in their towns and in their state to help out the Republican Party. But in 1960, Cliff White and Bill Buckley and that whole group wanted to push Barry Goldwater to become the nominee. Now, he stood up there and declined the nomination. But in that process, he made a statement that really accelerated the growth of conservatism. And he looked out on the audience and he said, "Grow up, conservatives. You can take back this party. Just go to work." And work we did. And it culminated in him being nominated in 1964 as a presidential candidate. And I remember all of that. Ronald Reagan came and made a speech. He was at one time a Democrat, but then he became a Republican, and he believed in the conservative movement, and he came and helped out. I remember all the Young Americans for Freedom that were created by Bill Buckley in Sharon, Connecticut in, I think, 1962 or something like that. Young Americans for Freedom were all over the place with signs and banners and rallying the people, and it was probably one of the most notorious conventions of the time, because pitted against Barry Goldwater was a liberal New York East Coast liberal establishment that had dominated the Republican Party for so many years. And those individuals kind of just went along to get along. They had no political philosophy or any kind of game plan. They just kind of went along. And my father would have no part of that. He said, we have to believe in something. And he defined what we were going to believe in. And let me just read from you in the book that he wrote, Conscience of a Conservative, of what he believed. And it says here, the root difference between the conservatives and the liberals of today is that conservatives take account of the whole man, while the liberals tend to look only at the material side of man's nature. The conservative believes that man is in part an economic animal, creature, but that he is also a spiritual creature with spiritual needs and spiritual desires. In other words, he believed that that each of us were, yes, we were concerned about our economic welfare, but if you dig deeper, we're also spiritual beings that creates us as an individual. Each of us in this room, we may get along, we know each other's name and families and what have you, but still, we're still individuals. And we were made that way because we are a spiritual being. And the philosophy of the conservative is that we need to allow this individual as much freedom and much liberty and much room as he can afford without hurting his neighbor, to expand on his own desires, his own ambitions, his own vision, and how hard he's going to work. I think the important thing of government is to create a situation where we all kind of start at the same time. But there's no guarantee we'll finish up that way. But the liberal will say, you know, they want people, the liberal wants everybody to wind up the same, whereas the conservative wants everyone to start out the same. And that's the basis of the conservative philosophy, that we're spiritual beings, we're individuals who have the right to maximize our efforts and our future. And that formed the basis of his core belief. Now, 1964, I crisscrossed the country on behalf of my father. My brother and my sister did the same thing. I remember I would take an airline to Illinois, and I would charter a 2-engine aircraft, a little Cessna. I had a pilot's license at the time, and I would hop down through Oklahoma, and Indiana, and all the Midwest states, into these little towns. And I remember one time I was in Ottumwa, Iowa. It's the first time I've ever seen a sled contest where you have a tractor pull. That's what it's called, tractor pull. And they'd have a big slab of steel, and the tractor would pull it, and every few feet people would get on. Pretty soon the tractor would stop. And whoever could pull that sled the farthest won something. And I was amazed at that. But I got to meet a lot of wonderful people, many of whom I still call friends. But let me talk a little bit more about my father. Growing up with him was an interesting experience, to say the least. I gotta say, he probably turned out to be a better statesman than he did a father. But I can't complain, because the limited amount of time when he was over in Burma flying the hump during the Second World War, he was involved in politics. He wasn't home very much, but when he was at home, I mean, we were a family, we stayed together, we did things together. He would take us out of school on a Friday, and we'd all pile into the Green Dragon, which was in those days the Chevrolet, almost like today's SUVs. They didn't call them SUVs then, I don't know what they called them. Station wagon. He had it all fitted up with a B-24 generator, so we could have electricity. He had it all fixed up, so we had no table on the outside. Anyway, he would take us out and go, oh, no, I need one of these. Go give me another one. You never want to take good whiskey out of a guy's hand. Well stated. But he would take us out, and I bet you I have been all over the state of Arizona. We spent a lot of time in Prescott. We had a cabin up near where the YMCA camp was, or used to be. We explored the Grand Canyon. We went down the Colorado River on rafts and boats several times. He had a part interest in a trading post called Rainbow Bridge trading post. And in those days, my dad and his partner had a concession from the national parks to take people on a horseback 14 miles down to see the Rainbow Bridge. Today you can drive up to it with a boat because of Lake Powell. And but in those days you had to ride a horse and a mule 14 miles. And in the summers I would work up there, Rainbow Lodge, and I'd work up with the cowboys. And we'd get up at 5 o'clock, and it was my job to put the feed sack on the mules and horses, get them ready and saddled up to take the tourists down to see the bridge. And my job was to lead about a 3 or 4 pack train with the bedrolls and food and all the necessities for 2 or 3 days. And that was a wonderful experience for me. There you go. There you go. But he would take us up to the Indian reservations, and we would walk back through the canyons and see the ruins. And I learned to speak Navajo and count, because we traded with the Indians. I'm not too good today, but I can still count. Oxide not the top D, Esma, Ascot, so say P, Nes T. How about that? But it was a rich period of my life growing up with him, because even though he wasn't around that much when he was, he shared with us the history, the geography, and the beauty of Arizona. And he once said to me, he said, Barry, when you walk through the forest, you're walking with God, and don't ever forget it. At another time he told me, he said, Barry, there's more strength in one pine tree than you'll find in many men. But he also reminded me that as you go through life, the dust you stir up will follow on others, and they'll never forget. He reminded me once when I asked him what I should be when I grow up. Now, this is one of my big disappointments in life. I said, Dad, what should I be? And I'm expecting him to write back saying, well, I think you should be a lawyer or a banker or a pilot or something. He writes me back this letter saying, well, you should be, if you ask me what you should be when you grow up, you should be as you are now. Believing in God, being kind to others, working hard, and deciding that whatever you decide to do, you will work a full day's work, a full week's work, a full month, a full year for the rest of your life. I'm thinking to myself, what kind of advice is that? Many years later, that was pretty good advice from a father, because he basically said it's up to you. Whatever you want to do, you can do it. And I learned this rude lesson that Billy talked about when my father and his brother Bob and his sister Carolyn, who owned the Goldwater stores, and at the time there were 2 or 3 of them at Prescott, Phoenix, I think they had one in Las Vegas. There was such a low margin of profit that one hiccup could wipe out the whole family, and they decided to sell it, which they did. All my life growing up, I worked in that store in one capacity or another. I polished the brass, cleaned the windows, worked in the different departments. I learned how to measure and lay out patterns on cloth. I knew a good feel or a good hand. I knew all about fabrics, the warp and the weave, how clothes are made. I wanted to take over and run that store. That was my passion. So the year I graduated, I'm standing outside of the graduation with a diploma in my hand and no job. Well, they sold that business right out from under me. And I was greatly disappointed, and I mean, it was a real disappointment. And I went up to my father and I said, you knew what I wanted to do. You knew I wanted to get in this business and take it over and run it. He said, well, that was not your place to do. He said, I gave you an education. You go out and use it. So all my life, I've learned that you can't lean on others. You gotta depend on yourself. Do what you think is right, and not be afraid to work a full day, full week, full month, full year, the rest of your life. And I followed that admonition and advice most of my life. So far, I haven't gotten into trouble. But getting back to Senator Goldwater in the 1964 presidential campaign, that was very interesting because he really didn't want to run for president. He was good friends with John F. Kennedy, and he used to go down to the White House and sit in Kennedy's rocking chair, and the two of them would be drinking whiskey all day. And they talked about running against each other. And they decided that if that was going to happen, they would get one airplane and they would travel around the country, much like the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and debate each other. They'd only have to have one airplane, one makeup artist. You know, it would be very economical. And that was planned, and they had that pretty well organized and ready to go. And of course, when John Kennedy was assassinated, it took a lot of the steam out of his sail. And he really did not think, he didn't want to do it. And the other thing that he realized is that the country probably was not ready for 3 presidents inside of, what, 3 or 4 years. And so he knew that if he ran, it'd be a long shot if he ever won. But the thing that convinced him was that he finally realized that he kind of started this whole thing. When he went out around the country and talked with the people and got them stirred up, got them organized, got them mounted and ready to fight, that he couldn't leave them and drop them. That somehow he wound up in the front as their leader, and that he didn't want to disappoint them by not running. And I think it was a good thing that he did that, because the conservative movement has caught fire. Most Americans really are conservative when you stop and think about it. Most people believe in the American way of life. They believe in liberty. They believe in justice, and they want to be left alone. And over the years, we've watched this government of ours just roll right over us. And in spite of that, we still are optimistic. We still believe that we can change things. We still believe that the conservative way is the only way, and all we have to do is elect good Republicans and conservatives, Democrat or Republican, to public office. You know, Winston Churchill once described the predatory nature of the Nazis. He noticed that in a zoo there was a lion and a lamb living peacefully and harmoniously together. And one day a tourist asked the keeper, where did they get such a magnificent lion? And the gatekeeper says, the lion is not the problem. The problem is we have to find a new lamb every day. You know, that is our challenge. That is our challenge as conservatives, as lovers of liberty, is to find new voters every day. Is to talk and convince them of our way and of our thoughts and of our process. That a job is much better solution to welfare than a welfare check. That individualism and individual responsibility and the family unit is so much more important than mother government and the government monopoly. So we have our work cut out as conservatives and as people who are interested in politics. You know, the quality of the laws that we live under are greatly determined by the quality of the men and women that we elect to public office. That's why I was so happy to see that my buddy Noel won the election, and he's going to work with Terrence Fan. We've got some good candidates in the Republican Party from the very top all the way down. And I think this is the year of the Republican. But let me just remind you, I've suggested to Noel that if he ever gets into trouble during one of his speeches and things, and they start running him out of town, then he needs to get out in front and pretend it's a parade. to the city to politicians. Now we just changed the law. But politics can be a lot of fun. It's an important thing, part of our life and of our liberties. I can only look back on my father and the contribution that he made with a great deal of pride. I was blessed to grow up as his son, and even blessed more that he gave me the honest qualities that I needed to live my life and to be involved and to be able to stand up here in front of you to say thank you for all your contributions, what you do, and what you stand for, and that is defense of liberty. Thank you very much.